Airport crew refused to let a black CEO board, but his son calmly handed them his father's airline ID, and the room went silent. They refused to let the black CEO board, thinking a badge and rules could stop him. They didn't realize his son held the key, his father's airline ID. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always crumbles when faced with real authority. Sir, this lane is restricted to VIP travelers. The voice cracked through the airport terminal like a sudden wind against still glass. Dr. Darius Vernell stopped mid-step, his boarding pass raised in his right hand, his left gripping the small, warm fingers of his son, Cashin. The boy looked up, confused. Darius turned toward the speaker, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a stiff navy blue uniform whose name badge read Brax Lawnmare. His posture was firm, jaw set like concrete. The tone wasn't curious. It was confrontational. I am a VIP traveler, Darius said evenly. No sarcasm, no aggression, just clarity. He extended the pass. Priority 1. Dr. Darius Vernell. Brax didn't even glance at the barcode, let alone scan it. There must be a mistake, he said, waving a dismissive hand. We'll need to re-verify your status. Darius blinked once. The terminal's noise faded to the background. The muffled wheels of roller bags, the dull intercom echoing overhead, the shuffle of impatient shoes behind him. But this moment slowed. I'm the keynote speaker at the Haven Reach Summit, Darius said. This flight was arranged 2 months ago through the airline's executive liaison. You can scan the code. Brax shrugged. I don't make the list, he said, expression unreadable. But you're not on it. The tension started rising like cabin pressure. Behind Darius, other passengers moved past unhindered, most of them white men in dark suits, boarding without delay or scrutiny. Darius noted their glances, some indifferent, some puzzled, none stopping. One gate agent in the corner leaned in and whispered something to Brax. His lips barely moved, but whatever he said made Brax's spine straighten. His eyes sharpened. Step aside while we verify your identity, Brax repeated, louder this time. Cashin tugged at Darius's jacket. Why can't we go, Dad? He asked, voice quiet but tight with concern. Darius knelt slowly to Cashin's level, placing a calm hand on the boy's shoulder. It's okay. We'll get on that plane. Just stay with me. His voice was gentle, but inside, Darius felt a familiar churn. Not anger yet, not fear either. Just a cold, deliberate assessment. He'd faced worse than this, but this wasn't about him. Not this time. When Darius stood, he saw 2 uniformed airport security officers approaching from the left side of the terminal, notified by Brax with a small hand signal. One officer, younger and slightly hesitant, rested his palm near his belt holster. The other scanned the line without looking at Darius directly. This is absurd, Darius said, turning toward them. I'm standing in the correct line. My son and I have confirmed seats. Just cooperate, sir, the younger officer murmured. It's a policy check. Darius narrowed his eyes. Policy or profiling? No one answered. Brax folded his arms, emboldened now that backup had arrived. We don't owe you an explanation, sir. Cashin's grip tightened around his father's fingers. His face was starting to crumple, eyes beginning to water. The boy's voice was barely a whisper. Are we in trouble? Darius's mouth tensed, not from fear, but control. He scanned the space. In the corner near the security desk, a man in a green vest marked Inspector, Flight Commission, stood observing. He looked down at a clipboard, then glanced up. Darius met his gaze, nodded subtly. A signal, a plea for intervention. The man paused. Then he turned and walked away. The betrayal burned more than Brax's tone. From behind one of the security guards, a voice murmured just loud enough to pierce the space. He might be on their watch list. It was a whisper, but not a quiet one. The ripple through the surrounding passengers was instant. A few slowed their steps. 1 or 2 stopped walking altogether. Phones tilted subtly forward. Murmurs gathered like a low wind. Darius's voice dropped an octave, calm but sharpened by intent. Cashin, he said softly, never breaking eye contact with Brax. Open my briefcase. The boy looked up, uncertain. Now? He asked. Yes, Darius replied. Now. Cashin crouched and clicked open the front latch. Inside sat a black leather ID wallet. It wasn't large. It wasn't flashy, but it carried weight. Embossed on the front were 4 silver words. Executive Access, North Vantage Aeroworks. The boy pulled it out with trembling fingers. Darius took the badge gently, flipped it open, and held it up so it caught the terminal light. Inside was a hard plastic card bearing his name, a barcode, a seal, and a small gold chip embedded near the bottom right. Only 2 types of people in the aviation world carried this badge: Federal Air Clearance engineers and aircraft line owners. Darius was both. But the voice that followed was not his. This is my dad's airline, Cashin said quietly. He built this plane. And suddenly, the terminal wasn't quiet because of order. It was quiet because the truth had just changed the atmosphere. Ending line unchanged. But Brax signals 2 nearby security officers. Then we'll do this the hard way. The security officers were already closing in, their hands drifting subtly toward their utility belts. The tension in the air was electric, thick with the weight of silent judgment. Passengers nearby shifted uneasily but remained rooted in place, their eyes casting brief, conflicted glances before turning away. Not one voice rose to question what they were witnessing. This is absurd, Darius said, his voice steady, unflinching, as if drawn from a deeper reservoir than the moment itself. He did not step back. He didn't flinch. He merely stood tall, hands still gently clutching his son's. His composure was unsettling to the officers, one of whom hesitated, then muttered as if trying to excuse himself from what he already suspected was wrong. Just cooperate, sir. It's a policy check. Darius's eyebrows arched faintly. Policy, he said, pausing long enough to let the word echo between them. Or profiling? Brax Lawnmare, the gate officer who had initiated this confrontation, folded his arms across his chest. His voice held no hesitation. We don't owe you an explanation, he snapped, as though his authority were a shield from reflection. Behind Darius, little Cashin let out a whimper and clutched tighter to his father's leg. The sudden shift from calm travel to confrontation had overwhelmed the child's defenses. Tears began to well up in his eyes, and within moments, he was crying, a quiet, confused sob that cut through the terminal noise more sharply than any shouted accusation. Darius knelt beside him, the movement slow, deliberate. It's okay, son, he whispered. We'll get on that plane. His hand rested gently on Cashin's back as if grounding both of them in the middle of a storm. His eyes then lifted toward a man lingering at the fringe of the unfolding drama, an older official wearing a green vest marked Inspector, Flight Commission. Darius locked eyes with him, giving a subtle, respectful nod, a silent call for reason, for procedure, for someone with authority to intervene and end this nonsense. But the inspector blinked, shifted uncomfortably, and turned away. Darius felt it like a slap without sound. The betrayal, small, cowardly, and cruel, told him more than words ever could. Must be on their watch list. One of the security guards muttered to the other, but loud enough for several passengers to hear. The whisper hit like a match dropped into a dry field. A murmur spread. Words like watch list, threat, and security began to pass from person to person, reshaping the narrative in real time, away from injustice and toward suspicion. Darius could feel the momentum shifting. This wasn't just about a boarding pass anymore. This was about perception, about image, about who was allowed to walk freely and who had to prove they deserved the right to exist without scrutiny. He looked down at his son, still trembling, and made a decision, not out of fear, but out of clarity. This would not be another moment buried in silence. It would not pass as just another indignity that his child would be expected to forget. Cashin, he said, his voice low but resolute. Open my briefcase. The boy blinked through tears, confused at first, then nodding. He slipped the latches open with small, shaky fingers. Inside, Carefully nestled in a custom leather sleeve was a black ID wallet. Cashin retrieved it with both hands, careful not to drop it. The front was embossed in silver. Executive Access, North Vantage Aeroworks. Darius stood again, calm and upright, as Cashin turned and held the badge toward the officers. His small voice cracked, but it carried clearly through the silence. "This is my dad's airline," he said softly. "He built this plane." And with those words, honest, trembling, and defiant, the air shifted. The line between authority and overreach had been exposed, and it was a child who had drawn it. "This is my dad's airline," he says softly. "He built this plane." "Scan it," Darius said again, his voice low but sharp, like the click of a lock disengaging. The handheld scanner trembled slightly in the security officer's grip as he looked between the badge and the man standing tall before him. There was a palpable pause, one not of laziness, but fear. The badge Cashin had held moments earlier was now cradled in Darius's hand like a piece of loaded truth. Its black matte casing gleamed faintly under the overhead lighting, reflecting not just authority, but history. The guard glanced at Brax for silent permission. Brax didn't nod, he didn't speak. His jaw had clenched so tightly, the cords in his neck looked like drawn wires. His arms remained folded, but the bravado had drained from his posture. He shifted one foot back ever so slightly, the stance of someone unsure if they should run or retreat inward. "Scan it," Darius repeated, enunciating each syllable like an instruction no longer optional. The scanner finally moved. A click, then a buzz, then the faintest electronic chime. Beep, beep, flash. A ring of soft blue light pulsed from the scanner's center. Verified. Executive Tier Authority. Dr. Darius Vernell. "Clearance 6B, said the robotic voice, calm and exact, filling the space with unchallengeable finality. Everything froze. For one long moment, there was no sound but the humming of the ventilation ducts and the distant boarding calls echoing from another terminal. Even the distant luggage cart halted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Shoes stopped tapping. Phones slowly lifted into the air, like the silent blooming of 100 unseen witnesses. Passengers stared, not at Darius, but at the screen of the scanner. Then at Brax, then back at Darius. The quiet formed a cocoon around the moment, as if the terminal itself held its breath. Darius didn't blink. He looked directly at the man who had tried to erase his dignity with one phrase. "This must be a mistake. What would have happened if I wasn't carrying that badge today?" he asked. His voice was steady, but beneath it ran the thunder of restraint held on a thread. His eyes never left Brax's. Brax opened his mouth as if to reply, but no words came. His gaze darted to the security officers, then to the passengers filming, then back to the man whose identity had just shattered his assumptions. "What lesson were you teaching my son?" Darius continued. Cashin, still small beside him, half hid behind his father's coat. His eyes darted from the badge to the guard to Brax, trying to understand something too large, too cruel for a child's heart to make sense of. The officer with the scanner cleared his throat and stepped back instinctively, as if proximity to truth had singed him. The second guard lowered his hand from his utility belt. Brax started, his voice a dry scrape in his throat. It's standard vetting, sir." Darius tilted his head slightly. "Standard?" he repeated softly, but with razor focus. The passengers still filming leaned closer. "You didn't question anyone else in this line," Darius said. "You didn't scan any other badge. You didn't stop the man with the designer luggage or the one laughing loudly about stock options. You saw a black father and presumed a lie." His words didn't rise in volume. They didn't need to. They dropped like stones into a still lake, rippling through every silent judgment, every microglance, every unsaid bias in that terminal. Brax stepped back as if pushed. The ground didn't move, but he swayed nonetheless. At the far end of the corridor, two airport supervisors began walking briskly toward the scene, alerted by the scanner's executive ping. Their badges glinted beneath their navy blue coats, but they slowed as they took in the tension in the air. The cameras, the silence, the officer's pale face, and the child clinging to his father. One of the supervisors reached for his radio, whispering something hurriedly into it. The other began speaking into his earpiece, eyes wide. And still Darius stood unmoved. Cashin tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Dad?" he whispered. "Can we get on the plane now?" Darius knelt beside him, his voice suddenly tender. "Soon, son." But then, rising again, he turned his head just slightly and spoke, loud enough for every phone, every witness, every child and parent in the terminal to hear. "Remember this moment, Cashin. Not because they stopped us, but because we didn't let them define who we are. Dr. Vernell, I deeply apologize. This shouldn't have happened." The voice cut through the airport's uneasy murmur like a plane slicing low fog. All heads turned as a supervisory officer stepped forward, his steps precise, his jaw clenched. His nameplate read Harvin Grell, and his pressed blazer, marked with silver piping and an airport seal, did little to disguise the storm behind his eyes. He looked at the unfolding scene with the demeanor of someone sent to extinguish a fire that had already scorched the foundation. Darius didn't flinch. He stood squarely, one hand lightly resting on Cashin's shoulder, the other still holding the executive clearance badge. Behind him, passengers whispered and recorded, their phones held just low enough to feign privacy, just high enough to catch history. Brax Lawnmare, the gate officer whose smug resolve had begun to crack, turned slightly toward Harvin. "Sir, Enough," Harvin said flatly, without looking at him. His tone left no space for rebuttal. "Step away from the gate." Brax's mouth opened once, shut again. He glanced at the cluster of security officers beside him, silent now, uncertain whether to hold position or retreat. The authority they had leaned on had just been stripped away. Slowly, Brax took one step back, then another. The movement, though small, was seismic. Harvin finally looked at Darius, his expression tight but not hostile. "Sir, you are more than cleared. The plane is waiting for you." Darius didn't respond right away. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to allow the gravity of the moment to settle around everyone watching. Then, with calm precision, he asked, "What about accountability?" Harvin blinked. Darius stepped forward once. "What about what just happened in front of 100 people? In front of my son?" The murmurs around them rose slightly. A couple at the back of the boarding line nodded solemnly. Even one of the uniformed officers shifted awkwardly. Harvin hesitated for the first time. "We'll open an investigation," he offered, the words coming slowly, as though shaped by obligation more than intent. Darius's jaw flexed. "I'll be opening one too," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried. He reached into his coat, pulled out a sleek business card, and handed it to one of the security guards. "You'll hear from my legal office." Cashin, eyes wide, clung tightly to his father's hand. The boy hadn't spoken since the confrontation began, but now he looked up at Darius with a quiet awe that pierced the moment like sunlight through clouds. Escorted by Harvin and now cleared attendants, Darius and Cashin finally approached the jet bridge, the same one that, moments ago, had been an invisible wall. The hush of first-class passengers broke into cautious nods as the two boarded, some out of respect, others perhaps out of shame. As they settled into their seats, a man 2 rows across leaned slightly forward. His tie was loosened, his face weathered with age, but his eyes were earnest. "You handled that with grace," he whispered. Darius gave a small nod but said nothing. Cashin turned toward the window, the world outside nothing more than tarmac and terminal glass, but his mind was elsewhere. "Dad," he began hesitantly, his voice a fragile string. "Why'd they stop us?" Darius exhaled. He leaned back in his seat, the stiff fabric pressing against his shoulders. "Sometimes people don't see who you are," he said softly. "They see what they're afraid of. That's why we show them the truth, even when it hurts." Cashin nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but understanding enough. At the front of the plane, the captain made a subdued announcement. thanking passengers for their patience. Behind that microphone, somewhere in the cockpit, the crew likely knew what had unfolded at the gate. But the tone remained neutral, controlled, just another delay on just another flight. At least on the surface. What Darius didn't know was that back in Valor City, in the glass-clad boardroom of Northvantage Aeroworks, the footage from the gate had already been uploaded, shared, and played on silent loop across a curved high-resolution screen. 3 men stood before it, suits sharp, expressions grave. One of them, an executive with silver-streaked hair and a Northvantage lapel pin, stared at the moment Darius held up his badge. He wasn't supposed to use that badge in public, the man muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He's drawing too much attention. The landing gear touched down with a soft jolt, and the seatbelt signs blinked on as Flight V927 rolled to a stop at the Haven Reach International runway. Dr. Darius Vernell hadn't touched his in-flight drink. His mind had been orbiting something far greater than the aerospace summit awaiting him. He powered on his phone the moment the cabin lights brightened, and the notifications hit like turbulence. 3 missed calls, 11 texts, 2 voicemails. He opened one message from a fellow engineer. "You're trending. Gate incident footage is everywhere." Another ping followed from a journalist. Then a third. "Can we quote your son's line about the badge?" Stunning moment. Darius swallowed hard. The video had gone public, and it had gone viral. Headlines from news networks now painted the incident with bold indignation. Black CEO denied boarding on plane he helped design. Dr. Darius Vernell refused entry by airport staff, despite clearance. Northvantage leader questions profiling after gate confrontation. Darius stared out the window. Beneath the calm glass of the terminal, a storm was brewing. As the aircraft doors hissed open, Cashin clutched his father's hand tightly, his small fingers still visibly shaken from what had happened hours earlier. Darius didn't speak until they were both through the jet bridge and into the sleek, mirrored corridors of Haven Reach's summit wing. He bent to his son's height. "You okay?" Cashin nodded but didn't smile. "Are they going to be mean again?" Darius gave him a slight grin, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Not here. Not today. Let's remind them why we're in the sky." Minutes later, the summit began. Hundreds filled the modern auditorium, engineers, executives, and scholars. Darius stepped onto the platform with the same gray suit he'd worn that morning, now slightly wrinkled but defiant. He addressed the crowd without notes, speaking on propulsion systems and modular jet intelligence. But it was the weight behind his words, echoes of what had happened at Velron, that gave the room pause. A standing ovation followed. Cameras flashed. Cashin beamed proudly. But Darius's piece was brief. His phone buzzed again during the summit's closing reception. "Unknown number." He answered. "Quite the spotlight you've stirred up." Came a voice, low, slow, familiar. It was Jaron Vale. Darius's back stiffened. Years ago, Jaron, a federal contractor and former insider, had pitched him a secretive buyout scheme. He wanted control of Northvantage's experimental aircraft division. Darius refused. The deal had smelled of coercion and shadow partnerships. Now Jaron sounded amused. "You sure you want this kind of attention?" he continued. "Not all battles are won in daylight." Darius stepped away from the crowd and found a quieter corner near the garden terrace. His voice stayed composed, but his eyes narrowed. "I don't hide from injustice." There was a chuckle on the line. "You always did like the high road. Just remember, some roads disappear when no one's looking." Click. The call ended. Darius stared at the screen, mind calculating. This wasn't just media fallout, it was awakening enemies long thought dormant. Meanwhile, back at Velron International, the camera still rolled. A week later, another black traveler stepped up to gate C14. He was dressed sharply, carried a conference badge, and had already cleared 2 checkpoints. Yet Brax Lammer's replacement, a man in the same navy blue uniform, suddenly motioned for a random screening. The traveler's eyes stayed calm. "Of course," he said, adjusting his tie and lifting the flap of his carry-on. But nestled inside was a recording device, covert, high definition, and live streaming. The footage didn't scream. It whispered, just like the first. Back in Valor City, Darius reviewed the clip on a secure server. No confrontation this time, just quiet obstruction wrapped in protocol. He played it twice, then turned to Cashin, who sat nearby working on a paper model of the aircraft design from his father's keynote. "They're still doing it," Darius said. Cashin looked up. "Even after the badge?" Darius nodded slowly. "Because they think no one's watching." Cashin considered that for a long moment. "But we are." Later that evening, as the car moved through the quiet suburban streets toward home, Cashin leaned his head against the window, eyes half closed, still trying to understand the weight behind his father's silence. Darius, hands steady on the wheel, spoke softly. "It's not over just because it's quieter," he said, gaze fixed ahead. "Sometimes the loudest fight is the one nobody sees." The whirring drone paused outside the window at 7:03 p.m., exactly when Cashin was setting his notebook on the kitchen table. Its movements weren't random. It didn't wobble like a consumer-grade model or retreat when seen. It hovered, studied, tracked. Cashin tilted his head. "Dad?" he called out, uncertain. "There's something weird outside." Darius was already in motion from the adjacent office. His pace was fast but measured, his footsteps absorbed by the thick rugs lining the hallway. He stepped beside Cashin, eyes narrowing at the dim light blinking beneath the drone's body. His expression didn't shift. He didn't flinch. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a device no bigger than a paperback, sleek, matte black, with a single thumb dial and an angular sensor protruding from the side. The scanner came to life in his hands, flashing silently. Darius swept it across the window, locking on the drone. Numbers spilled across the interface. Unmarked. "No registry." The signal route pinged twice before vanishing. Third-party, military-grade cloaking. "But the node bounced through Haverteka's proxy layers," he said quietly, more to himself than to Cashin. Cashin swallowed. "Is it watching us?" "Yes," Darius replied, calmly, coldly, with the certainty of a man who had seen this game before, just not in his own backyard. He placed the scanner on the table and turned fully to his son. "From now on, if you ever see something outside that hovers but doesn't blink twice per second, I want you to come to me immediately." "No hesitation." "Understood." Cashin nodded. "Understood." At North Vantage's Valor City headquarters the next morning, the boardroom buzzed with tension. 10 members sat in a semicircle of glass-backed chairs. At the head of the table was Roel Venter, acting board liaison, while Grathen Roan paced with the restlessness of someone rehearsing a confrontation. "This is spiraling," Grathen snapped, slapping a folder down onto the table. He brought national media attention to a boarding gate altercation. "Our brand is bleeding." "Darius didn't leak the footage," Roel reminded, voice steady. "And the footage didn't create the problem. The truth did." "He had every right to file a complaint internally," Grathen shot back. "Not go viral, not speak in front of the commission, not show encrypted clearance data at a press conference. That badge he used wasn't meant for public display. It verified his identity. It risked the Havertek joint venture." The room paused at that. Roel adjusted his cufflink slowly. "So that's what this is about." The unsaid truth broke surface. For the last 2 quarters, negotiations with Havertek Industries had been occurring behind closed doors, pushed forward by legacy board members hoping to reclaim lost contracts. Darius had been the lone dissenting voice, blocking the deal, citing ethical inconsistencies in Haverteka's surveillance subsidiary and its military overlap. Now the board was fractured and under fire. "There's something else," Roel said, leaning forward, voice low. "An internal memo surfaced from 6 months ago. It references a contingency tier protocol, a system that allows travel clearance overrides for executives. It uses badge data. That system wasn't approved by Darius." Grathen scoffed. "He's the only one who cares who stamps the forms." "No," Roel replied. "He's the only one who caught what they were doing with it." Meanwhile, back at the Vernell residence, Darius was examining the drone telemetry he pulled the night before. His custom-built analyzer had managed to trace a sliver of the handshake back to a dormant IP used by a surveillance contractor, Graven DataOps. A shell firm. One that had appeared in a background check years ago when Darius rejected Haverteka's private offer. He looked down at the stream of data, paused on a fragment labeled shadow_ping 12B. The code didn't belong to anything Northvantage had ever used, nor had it ever been filed through the Federal Commission's standard encryption pathways. "They want me silenced," Darius said under his breath. Cashin, seated nearby with a model of a jet engine, looked up. "What will you do?" Darius turned toward him, his eyes sharp but calm, his voice solid. "Build what they fear most, evidence. 3 of our engineers signed off on it. Quietly, under a fake project name." Bren Talek's voice barely cracked above a whisper, but the words detonated like a silent charge inside Darius Vernell's office. The blinds were drawn. The glass walls, usually clear, had been digitally frosted for privacy. Darius didn't move. He stood at the window, staring out at the engineering tarmac of Northvantage's Valor City campus, his arms crossed, jaw tight. He finally turned, his gaze sharp and deliberate. "You're sure it wasn't an accident?" Bren nodded grimly, unfolding a small set of decrypted files on a secure tablet. Project name was Pathtrace Alpha. On paper, it looked like a routine thermal analysis exchange with Havertek. But the attachments weren't thermal data. They were badge schematic files. 3 layers of encryption, but they buried the schematic signatures in the metadata. Darius walked slowly to the table and stared down at the screen. The schematics were unmistakable, his own design, executed with flawless precision, but modified, subtly, maliciously. A new string embedded in the coding, flaggable, Tier 6 conditional. He exhaled slowly. "They didn't just share my tech. They weaponized it against me." "Exactly," Bren said, his voice quiet with tension. "They added a secondary ID string to your executive badge. Not visible to regular airport systems, but it trips certain behavioral profiling algorithms tied to what's now being called the contingency tier protocol." Darius straightened, fury low-burning in his chest. So when Brack scanned me at Velrin, he wasn't reacting to my race, at least not entirely. He was reacting to a tag. A digital smear. Bren closed the tablet. A ghost profile. A flag designed to make you look like a soft security risk. Enough to slow you down, delay you, humiliate you. "And who else has been flagged?" Darius asked, voice a notch lower now. "Do we know how many names they ran this on?" "We're still investigating. But I think you were a test run." Darius went silent, thoughts racing. His mind, engineered for aerodynamics and structural failure, now mapped sabotage the same way he'd map a hull breach. Quiet, invisible, devastating under pressure. The glass panel behind him hummed softly as it cleared for a moment, revealing the lab floors below. Rows of young engineers, unaware they were walking atop a trap door someone else had laid. He turned back to Bren. "No public action. Not yet." Bren nodded. "Understood. I want everyone who touched that Pathtrace Alpha file isolated from live clearance systems. Put them on review, but make it look like a routine audit. Keep them calm." "And the board?" "Not yet. Too many loyalties I haven't verified. We do this quiet." Bren hesitated. "And Cashin? You still want him placed in secure schooling?" Darius nodded. "Yes. I don't want him near public networks for now. Someone tried to reduce me to a blinking red warning light in a scanner. I won't let them draw a target on my son." The tension in the room deepened. Later that night, in a quiet study beneath the family quarters, Cashin sat at a drafting table, his fingers smudged with graphite, sketching a jet cockpit. It wasn't just doodling. The lines had thought, memory, structure. He was tracing what he'd seen his father study late at night. But this time, he added something new. A badge scanner with a question mark next to it. Darius watched from the doorway, unnoticed for a moment. Cashin's eyes were narrowed in concentration. His small shoulders hunched with purpose. A painful pride stirred in Darius's chest. His son was mirroring not just his craft, but his burden. "You ever wonder why a plane has backup systems?" Darius said finally, stepping into the room. Cashin looked up. So it doesn't fall if something breaks? Darius smiled faintly. Exactly. You build for the worst, even when you hope for the best. Is that why you were quiet after that day at the airport? Darius sat beside him. I was thinking how many things can break before something crashes. Not just planes. People. Systems. Trust. Cashin traced his pencil along the sketched scanner. They broke something in you? Darius looked at him, measured. They tried. But you reminded me how to fix it. Cashin blinked. How? You held up that badge, Darius said. Not because it was metal. Because you believed it meant something. That's what they were afraid of. Not me. Not the badge. Belief. The two sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the quiet hum of the estate's protective systems activating for the night. The next morning, in a sealed control room at North Vantage, Darius gathered a small circle of trusted personnel. Bren, 2 engineers with clean audit trails, and a systems analyst named Roan Marek. On a secure screen, the team dissected the metadata packets pulled from the PathTrace Alpha exchange. They didn't just share files, Roan said. They created synthetic fingerprint strings that mirrored real access keys. Enough to fool low-tier gate scans. And that means, Bren added, they didn't want to block you outright. That would have created backlash. They wanted to flag you, delay, question, humiliate, discredit you right before a merger vote. The word hit like a turbine roar. Merger. Havertech. Darius straightened. The merger he'd refused 2 years ago. The buyout masked as a partnership. The moment he chose integrity over gain. It all aligned now. They didn't want me stopped for optics, he said quietly. Fury honed into clarity. They wanted me flagged in a system they control. And just like that, the storm began to gather. They didn't want me stopped for optics. They wanted me flagged in a system they control. They hesitated, confident their decision would hold, unaware that the next move would expose their entire crew. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when truth steps in, hit subscribe now, because justice never waits. Darius didn't wait for the morning brief. At precisely 6:07 a.m., every North Vantage terminal server across the global fleet executed an encrypted patch. The clearance system stuttered for less than half a second, just long enough for any unauthorized overrides to log a trace. Silent lockdown initiated. The operation, titled Integrity Echo, had been prepared quietly for weeks, but Darius triggered it alone from his private terminal, bypassing all conventional audit paths. Only 3 other executives knew it existed. As the green system lights stabilized, he leaned back in his chair, eyes steady. The chessboard was finally shifting. He'd forced the first move. By noon, legal counsel had filed a sealed notice to the Federal Flight Commission, citing anomalies and inconsistencies in badge clearance authorizations at Velron International Airport. The language was deliberate, just enough to require a formal inquiry, not enough to spark headlines. For now. But the enemy was listening. That evening, as the Valor City winds howled against the reinforced glass of his penthouse study, Darius returned home to find an unmarked envelope on the marble kitchen counter. No postie. No name, just placed there like a dare. He opened it calmly, though his breath slowed the moment he saw what was inside. 8 printed photographs. They weren't digital scans, they were developed prints. One from 5 years ago in Lyon, standing beside a prototype turbine. Another outside his home with Cashin at age 3. One taken from across the street just last week. But the last image chilled him deepest. It was Cashin, now stepping into his school, backpack slung low, unaware of the lens tracking his small frame. Inside the envelope was a single card. The words were printed in thin red ink, as precise as a scalpel. Pull back or we come closer. Darius stood still, for almost a full minute. Then, without saying a word, he walked to the hidden compartment behind his study's south wall, tapped a biometric reader, and withdrew a slim silver case. Inside, a chip module just recently finalized. Not for sale. Not on any network. He walked to Cashin's room, sat beside him quietly, and offered the bracelet. Cashin looked up, puzzled. "Is this GPS?" "Something better," Darius said, fastening it gently to his wrist. "It listens even when the world doesn't." Cashin's brow furrowed. "Is something wrong?" "Not yet," Darius said, kissing the boy's head. "And that's how we'll keep it." The next day arrived like a storm hiding behind sunlight. Darius stood backstage at the Haven Reach Summit, where he'd been scheduled to speak on North Vantage's latest propulsion system. But he didn't bring slides, didn't bring specs. He brought a drive. The MC introduced him as a visionary in aerospace design, and applause filled the room. But when Darius stepped to the podium, he didn't return the gesture. He looked straight ahead, scanning faces, press, executives, lobbyists, a few from Havertech. "I was asked to speak on innovation," he began, voice low but clear. "But innovation without integrity is just elegant sabotage." The room stilled. He tapped the podium console, and a large screen blinked to life behind him. "This is a clearance log from Velron International, timestamped precisely 8:42 a.m. on the day of my boarding denial. Notice the override. An inserted flag marking me as unverified, despite my status being executive authorized less than 12 hours earlier." Gasps rippled. Cameras flicked up. Another tap. A video played. A silent exchange between a Havertech operations officer and a badge system technician. The file path shown behind them matched a North Vantage subsystem, illegally accessed under the guise of a research sync. Darius continued. "This override was approved remotely, outside the jurisdiction of any North Vantage protocol, which means the gate didn't glitch. It was programmed to reject me." Murmurs rose. The tension was no longer subtle. It was alive. He brought up one last file. A contract addendum with Havertech's watermark, referencing a tier shadow sync access agreement, signed by a name the audience hadn't expected. A former Velron Gate supervisor now under Havertech employment. Darius turned back to the crowd, his voice like sharpened steel. "They didn't just stop me at the gate. They built the gate to stop people like me." The fallout began before the sun even dipped below the skyline. Within hours of Dr. Darius Vernell's Haven Reach speech, and the encrypted evidence he laid bare, newsrooms ignited in synchronized bursts of outrage. Across every major outlet, the story broke wide open. Airport security layers compromised by private clearance flags, CEO targeted. But behind every flashy cheerin' and somber anchor voice, the consequences churned with teeth. At North Vantage headquarters, the executive floor turned cold with silence. Internal legal flagged the public disclosures as a trigger, and soon two senior engineers, both with clearance to back-end systems, were placed on administrative leave. Their names matched metadata entries in the logs that Darius's task team decrypted just days earlier. One had approved a patch labeled Scanner Optimization Tier, a title vague enough to hide the access flag embedded inside. The other had signed off on third-party credential testing under a code name that, once unraveled, matched a Havertech shell firm. Meanwhile, Brax Lawnmare, the gate agent whose refusal had sparked it all, was formally subpoenaed. Few expected his compliance. Fewer expected him to fold. He sat in a closed-door deposition room under oath, his hands twitching as he repeated a phrase that kept echoing louder with each word. "I was told to act suspicious. It was on the morning update. My scanner pinged his profile with a Tier 6 advisory. I didn't know what that meant, just that we were told to proceed with caution." His voice cracked. "I wasn't even supposed to question Priority 1 badges. I was told he was an exception." A federal investigator leaned forward. "Who told you that?" Brax swallowed hard. "It was uploaded from clearance control. That's all I knew." The puzzle completed itself in Darius's mind like a click in a sealed vault. It had never just been a case of personal bias, though bias played its part. The entire gate confrontation was orchestrated, a digital ambush designed to discredit him publicly right before the board's final vote on rejecting Havertech's merger offer. Character assassination, disguised as coincidence. At home, Cashin worked at his desk, surrounded by crayon-colored schematics and half-drawn jet wings. But this night, his hands moved slower. A teacher had asked the class to write about someone they admired. The boy had titled his draft, "What My Dad Taught Me at the Gate." The first sentence read simply, "He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He showed who he was until the truth couldn't hide." The essay began circulating among faculty without Cashin's knowledge. One teacher forwarded it to a local education blog. A junior editor read it aloud in a newsroom full of clicking keyboards. By evening, a journalist from the Havenreach Standard sent Darius an email, a request to publish the essay alongside a piece on ethical reform in aviation security. That night, seated in his quiet office, Darius stared at the message glowing on his screen. He scrolled down, reread his son's words. They were simple, unfiltered, honest. He knew the impact it could have if released. But he also knew the public's appetite for justice came in waves, and sometimes, the most powerful truths needed to be timed with silence. He clicked reply and typed only a few words. "Not yet," he wrote. "Let's wait until they think the story's over." The moment the federal agents seized Haverteka's server logs, a quiet storm began to build across the nation. In a dark-paneled control room at North Vantage's compliance division, the evidence came in, line by line, metadata chains, backdoor patches, unregistered operator access. A single folder titled Tier Shadow contained everything. No encryption, no password wall, just arrogance. One file in particular, Vernell.6b override.tag, was timestamped 3 months prior to the Velron airport incident. That was the proof. They had flagged Darius deliberately, not for any crime, not for security, but for obstruction. For standing in the way of Haverteka's silent takeover. For saying no. The news broke just after dawn. A whistleblower inside the Department of Transportation leaked the contents to a local news station, and by mid-morning it had gone national. Words like covert profiling, clearance rigging, and racial targeting flashed across ticker bars. Analysts were stunned, not only by the betrayal of public trust, but by the depth of the manipulation. Darius's face appeared on every screen, not as a victim, but as the man who had pulled the veil down in full view of the world. Inside North Vantage Tower, Darius stood in front of a digital blueprint, reviewing the last update to their executive ID framework. The glass wall behind him trembled slightly from the whir of outside helicopters. He didn't flinch. His voice was quiet but focused as he spoke to the handful of engineers and legal aides in the room. "No more patchwork," he said. "I want the new platform ready by end of quarter." One of the engineers looked up. "New platform?" Darius pointed at the center of the schematic. "We're gutting the system. Open source badge verification. Immutable logs. Federated oversight. No single company should ever have that kind of power again. Not even us." There was silence until one voice cracked it, Bren Talek, legal advisor. "You're dismantling your own control." "I'm dismantling the need for control," Darius replied. "We're not just removing bad actors. We're removing the temptation to ever become them." Outside the conference room, Cashin sat in a waiting area beside his tutor, rehearsing lines under his breath. His fingers fidgeted with the corner of a note card, bent from overuse. It was the speech he had written weeks ago, the one that began as a school project and ended up in the hands of a local journalist. His father had told him not yet. But today was different. The summit venue shimmered under Havenreach's steel blue sky, a modern glass structure lined with banners for education, technology, and ethics in leadership. Cashin adjusted the collar of his dress shirt as his name was called. He stepped onto the stage with a mix of nerves and something else. Resolve. In the crowd, Darius sat in the third row, arms folded, watching with quiet intensity. Cashin gripped the edges of the podium, took a breath, and began. "The day they stopped my father at the airport, I thought they were just confused, that maybe they didn't see what I saw. But then I realized they weren't confused. They were afraid. Afraid of someone who didn't look like power, but carried it anyway. That day, my dad didn't fight to board a plane. He fought so no kid like me ever has to be taught they don't belong in the sky." The room fell into stunned silence, then erupted into applause. But for Darius, it was something else that echoed, Cashin's voice, carrying more than pride, carried legacy, it carried truth, and it carried forward. He didn't rise to clap. He didn't need to. His eyes never left his son. That day, my dad didn't fight to board a plane. He fought so no kid like me ever has to be taught they don't belong in the sky. The tribunal ruling landed like a thunderclap. In a formal announcement carried live by national networks, the Federal Aviation Tribunal declared Havertech guilty of orchestrating a covert clearance profiling program known as Tear Shadow. The penalties were swift and severe. A 10-year ban from all federal transportation contracts, a financial penalty in the hundreds of millions, and full public disclosure of their involvement in blacklisting high-clearance individuals under fabricated, soft threat classifications. Inside the marble-paneled chamber, the decision brought silence, followed by a ripple of murmurs from the press gallery. Dr. Darius Vernell remained motionless in the front row, hands clasped, jaw steady. He didn't flinch, didn't nod. To most, it looked like poise. But inside, it was calculation. This wasn't justice. It was a beginning. Moments later, a senior official from the Office of Aviation Reform approached him with a handshake and an offer. "We'd like you to chair the ethics panel for the new oversight framework," he said, eyes wide with urgency. "You'd shape the entire next generation of protocol." Darius met his gaze. "No," he said without hesitation. The man blinked. I don't understand. I have a company to run, and a son to raise," Darius replied, voice even. "But I'll give you something better than a seat." He paused, then added, "A name." The room waited. "Call it the Gate Integrity Act." Later that afternoon, another closed-door session convened, not in a courtroom, but in the executive conference room of North Vantage Aeroworks. The board had reconvened to discuss the aftermath, now with eyes not on damage control, but legacy building. Darius stood at the head of the long walnut table, a large schematic projected behind him, not of a jet, but of a security framework. "No one company," he said, voice low but commanding, "should ever hold full dominion over who is allowed to move freely. Not us, not anyone. Which is why I'm proposing we create something bigger than North Vantage. A coalition." The room shifted uncomfortably. Grathan Rohn, a hard-jawed board member in a dark blue suit, leaned forward. "A coalition of who?" "Minority-led firms, technologists, civil ethicists, systems designers, people who've stood on the wrong side of that scanner and know what happens when power goes unchecked." "That's radical," Rohn scoffed. "You want to hand over security infrastructure to outsiders?" "No," Darius said flatly. "I want to hand it to the future." The proposal stunned the room. But Roel Venter, an older executive with silver temples and a voice like weathered stone, nodded slowly. "He's right. We keep control, we repeat the past. We share it, we change it." Tension rose again days later when the tribunal resumed for Brax Landmer's testimony. The gate officer who had stopped Darius now stood under oath, sweating beneath the courtroom lights. His voice cracked. "I thought I was following orders. I didn't think about the kid." In the back, Darius sat motionless, arms crossed, face unreadable. "I didn't know what was real," Brax stammered, tears falling freely. "They told me he was flagged. I believed them." When the testimony ended, reporters swarmed Darius outside the courthouse. "Do you feel vindicated?" one asked. "Do you forgive Brax?" Darius paused, his voice calm. "I feel relief he told the truth. That doesn't erase what happened. But it opens the door to change." The flashbulbs popped. A briefcase clicked shut. Somewhere, headlines were already being drafted. But for Darius, this moment wasn't about the press or the punishment. It was about the choice he'd made, again and again, to hold the door open rather than slam it shut. And that door now had a name, the Gate Integrity Act. The moment the plaque was unveiled, a gust of wind swept across Velron International's main concourse like a reset, brief, cleansing, weightless. Dr. Darius Vernell stood just behind the crowd barrier, hands at his sides, coat buttoned to the top, his eyes locked on the polished steel plate now embedded into the airport wall just above gate C11. The same gate where he'd once been stopped, doubted, flagged, humiliated. But now the terminal was silent. Not out of indifference, but reverence. A dozen reporters stood poised but restrained. No one shouted questions. No one dared interrupt what felt like a historical moment slowly etching itself into memory. Cashin stood next to him, a little taller now, the same sharp gaze in his eyes that mirrored his father's. He held a folded program in his hand, fingers fidgeting as he looked up at the quote engraved in clean, bold lettering beneath the Gate Integrity Act seal. That day, my dad didn't fight to board a plane. He fought so no kid like me ever has to be taught they don't belong in the sky. Cashin blinked twice. They really used it, he whispered. Darius gave the faintest nod. Word for word. There had been no guards to check them this time.
No escáner dilas. No suspicious glances.
Just the gentle wave of a greeter in a navy blazer and the soft click of their dress shoes across polished tile. That, Darius thought, was the revolution. Not grand speeches but the absence of resistance. But even in this moment of public recognition, Darius felt the weight in his coat pocket. The ID badge. He hadn't left it behind. Couldn't. Not out of fear but out of principle. It wasn't a symbol of access anymore. It was a scar pressed into plastic. A scar that still pulsed beneath the surface of this polished unveiling. Dr. Vernell, came a voice behind him. He turned to see a young man, early 20s maybe, wearing a black Northvantage internship lanyard. His voice trembled slightly. I'm one of the new applicants. I just wanted to say, I never even thought aerospace was a path until I saw the footage of what happened to you. And what you did after. Darius extended a hand, firm and warm. Then we're already flying higher than we were. The intern nodded, eyes gleaming with something between pride and disbelief. There's a waiting list to apply now, he added. Half my engineering class tried. A flicker of a smile crossed Darius's face, but his eyes flicked briefly toward a group of airport security agents watching from afar.
No hostility.
Just presence. Still, he made mental note. Trust might be earned, but vigilance was inherited. Back home, the wave had already started. Letters, messages, internship requests from across the country. One, handwritten in careful pencil by a 14-year-old in Chicago, had struck him hardest. Sir, I saw how they tried to stop you at the airport. I want to build a plane no one can stop you from flying. Cashin had found it first, laughing as he read it aloud. He writes like me, he said, his grin wide with recognition. That night, Darius had posted the letter on his company's internal page with one line beneath it. Let's make sure the next generation never has to fight the same war twice. Now, as he stood beneath the plaque with that same boy beside him, the crowd gently began to disperse. The ceremony was over. The cameras lowered, but Darius didn't move right away. His eyes lingered on the steel engraving, the quiet hum of passing luggage carts, the reverent hush that still clung to the air like the aftermath of thunder. A man with a stroller walked by slowly, pausing just long enough to glance at the plaque. His son, no more than 7, looked up at him with wide eyes. Who's that? The boy asked, pointing at Darius. The man crouched down beside him and whispered, loud enough for only a few to hear, That's the man who changed the gates. Cashin leaned closer to his father, voice low but clear. He didn't do it alone. The gate officer's voice cut through the terminal air like a well-timed cue in a film. Welcome aboard, Dr. Vernell. Thank you for what you've done. Darius paused at the threshold of the boarding bridge, just long enough to feel the weight of those words settle into the present moment. The terminal at Marin Bay Regional Airport wasn't grand or echoing with fanfare. It was modest, quiet, trimmed in aged wood panels and dull steel. But the man's tone carried something deeper than protocol. Gratitude, awareness. Cashin stood beside his father, holding a model aircraft in one hand and the strap of his travel backpack in the other. He was older now, taller, sharper in gaze, but still young enough to glance up at his father for silent cues. Darius didn't reply to the officer immediately. Instead, he studied the man. The uniform was crisp, the badge freshly polished, and most striking of all, the man's eyes didn't flinch when they met Darius's. The pause passed. Darius gave a single nod. "Appreciated," he said quietly, his voice rich but even. They stepped forward, entering the jet bridge not just as passengers, but as the carriers of something that had once nearly been denied to them. Passage without friction, identity without resistance. Inside the aircraft, the flight was already boarding. Passengers found their seats in orderly fashion. A few heads turned, not out of suspicion, but from recognition. It wasn't the first time Darius Vernell had been seen in public, but it was the first time no one looked away. Cashin took the window seat. He pressed his hand briefly against the cool plastic, watching as baggage handlers below guided cargo with fluorescent batons. The sky above Marin Bay was overcast, but calm. Inside the cabin, the quiet hum of settling engines provided a sense of motion before takeoff. Darius sat beside him, hands folded over a leather case. Inside, the prototype specs for Northvantage's upcoming Youth Mentorship Initiative, a mobile aerospace classroom capable of reaching rural high schools, rested against his palm. The project had taken shape slowly, piece by piece, inspired as much by data as by a single letter written by a boy in Ohio. "I want to build a plane no one can stop you from flying." The flight attendant passed by. "Can I get you anything before takeoff, sir?" he asked. Darius shook his head. "No, thank you." He glanced sideways at Cashin. "Everything I need is here." The boy smiled, leaning back. "Did you ever think it would feel this normal?" Darius tilted his head. "Normal isn't the same as safe. But yes, it feels earned." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, a flicker of memory crossed Darius's mind. That old terminal. The halted breath when a badge had to be used like armor. The silence of being doubted in front of a child. Now, years later, the silence felt different. Not oppressive, but earned. Claimed. He turned his wrist slightly, revealing the smartwatch synced to a chip embedded in Cashin's bracelet. The encryption protocol had been updated again last week. Not because of fear, but because trust didn't mean complacency. Even victories had to be maintained. "You still carry it?" Cashin asked, nodding toward the small metal case in the seat pouch. He knew what was inside. Darius gave a soft laugh. "Ido." "Why?" Darius looked out the window. His voice was calm, thoughtful. "It used to be protection. Now it's proof." Cashin didn't ask more. Some things didn't need explanation anymore. Not after what they'd built. As the plane lifted off the runway, the clouds peeled away to reveal streaks of blue between them. Cashin reached for his father's hand without thinking. Darius gave it a slight squeeze. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the engines, the steady rhythm of flight, the soft press of altitude, everything folded into one silent, resolute truth. They were not flying into just another destination. They were flying into a world that no longer questioned their right to be there. And they had helped make it so. They walked through, not just into a plane, but into a world they helped reshape, one badge, one voice, one gate at a time. And this time, nobody stopped them. They blocked the CEO and froze as his son handed over the airline ID, instantly proving who was really in command. If you believe true authority arrives quietly but decisively, subscribe now because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, arrogance, and the power of accountability when truth is revealed. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and treating every passenger with dignity.